My wife thought cheating was the worst thing I'd ever discover about her. For a while, I believed that, too. When I first saw the messages, I remember thinking this hurt would at least make sense. Cheating is painful, but it's familiar. People understand it. You confront, you grieve, you decide whether to stay or leave. There's a script for it. What I didn't realize was that the affair wasn't the betrayal. It was the explanation she wanted me to find. Because what I uncovered later didn't come with dramatic texts or obvious lies. It came in paperwork. In signatures I didn't remember signing. In decisions made quietly, months before I ever suspected anything was wrong. The cheating was real, but it was also convenient. Painful enough to keep me emotional, believable enough to stop me from asking better questions. And by the time I understood what was actually happening, I realized something that still makes my stomach drop. If I had reacted the way most people do when they find out they're being cheated on, I would have lost everything without ever knowing why. My name is Dijon, and before everything unraveled, my marriage looked fine. Not perfect, not dramatic. Just stable in the way people say adulthood is supposed to be. Marissa and I had been together for 11 years, married for 7. We met in our mid-20s, when life still felt like something you could plan instead of something that happened to you. She was ambitious, organized, always thinking 2 steps ahead. I was steadier, the kind of person who believed consistency mattered more than big moves. At the time, that felt like balance. From the outside, we made sense. We owned a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, no kids yet, but not because we didn't want them. We just kept saying not yet financially, not yet career-wise, not yet emotionally. It became a running joke until it stopped being funny. Marissa worked in marketing at a mid-sized firm. Deadlines, clients, long hours. I worked in IT, mostly remote after the pandemic. That meant I was home more. I cooked more, cleaned more, handled bills. I didn't mind. In fact, I took pride in it. I told myself this was what partnership looked like, picking up slack when the other person needed it, trusting each other to handle different parts of life. Looking back, that trust is what made everything else possible. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They never do. She didn't suddenly become cold or distant. She just stopped sharing. Conversations that used to wander turned short and efficient, like tasks being checked off. How was work? Busy, and that was it. Her phone habits changed too, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Screen always face down, notifications no longer visible. When I reached for it once, just to check the time, she stiffened. "I've got it," she said, a little too quickly. I laughed it off, made a joke. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid, that long relationships go through quiet phases, that expecting constant emotional transparency was unrealistic. What I didn't question, and should have, was how prepared she always seemed. Prepared with explanations, prepared with schedules, prepared with reasons that sounded reasonable if you didn't look too closely. Her workload increased, late meetings, dinners she couldn't skip. Sometimes she came home smelling like restaurants she loved, even though she claimed she'd eaten with coworkers she rarely named. Once, I asked if she was happy. She looked surprised, not defensive, just surprised. "Of course," she said. "Why wouldn't I be?" I didn't have an answer, just a feeling, and feelings, I believed, weren't evidence. So I stayed quiet. Weeks turned into months. We functioned well. That's the word I'd use. We coordinated calendars, paid bills, planned holidays without much enthusiasm. Intimacy didn't disappear, but it felt scheduled, like something we both agreed was still important, even if neither of us knew why anymore. I told myself this was what long marriages looked like once excitement faded. The night everything truly started wasn't dramatic. Marissa went upstairs to shower. Her phone buzzed softly on the coffee table. Normally, I would have ignored it. That night, I glanced at the screen without thinking. I didn't see the message, just the name, a name I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped in a way that felt physical, like something solid beneath me had cracked. I sat there staring at the phone, listing reasons not to touch it. Trust, privacy, respect. But one thought kept pressing harder than the others. If I don't look, this feeling doesn't go away. So I picked up the phone. And in that moment, before I unlocked the screen, I still believed the worst thing I could discover was that my wife was cheating on me. I had no idea how carefully wrong I was. I wish I could say I unlocked her phone with certainty, like I already knew what I'd find, like I was prepared. The truth is, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I remember thinking how stupid that was, how dramatic. It was just a phone. People get notifications all the time. This could be anything. I told myself I was only going to glance, just enough to calm the feeling clawing at my chest. The screen opened to an active message thread, not a notification preview. An ongoing conversation left open like it hadn't needed to be hidden. The contact name at the top read, Evan, client. For a split second, I felt relief. A client made sense. Marketing relationships blur. Late nights, dinners, constant texting. All of it could fit inside that explanation if you wanted it to. Then I read the messages. There was nothing explicit, no photos, no obvious sexual language. That almost made it worse. The intimacy lived in familiarity, inside jokes, shared references, the easy rhythm of two people who didn't need to explain themselves. Messages sent late at night. Messages waiting for replies first thing in the morning. Conversations that wrapped around the hours she was lying next to me in bed. One line stopped me cold. I hate lying to him, but this is the only way. I read it again and again. Him could only be me. My chest tightened, but I kept scrolling. Not because I wanted to, but because stopping felt impossible. I needed something clear, something undeniable. Proof strong enough to quiet the part of my mind still searching for innocent explanations. I found it. A message from her, sent just after midnight. I wish I could fall asleep next to you instead. That was enough. I locked the phone and set it back down exactly where it had been, like maybe I could rewind time if I didn't disturb anything else. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure she'd hear it through the shower. I didn't confront her that night, not because I was calm, but because I felt strangely disoriented, like I'd stepped into a story I recognized, but the details didn't line up the way they were supposed to. Cheating made sense. It hurt. It fit. It gave everything a shape I could understand. And yet, something about the messages bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. They didn't feel reckless. They weren't panicked. They felt managed, as if whoever wrote them wasn't worried about being discovered, just about when. I slept badly. When she came to bed, she wrapped an arm around me like she always had. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the same question over and over. Why did it feel like this was meant to be found? Over the next few days, I lived inside a fog. Outwardly, nothing changed. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I asked about her day. She answered the same way she always had, short, efficient, emotionally distant. Inside, everything felt unstable. Every time her phone buzzed, my attention snapped to it. Every time she smiled at something on the screen, something sharp twisted in my chest. I hated how quickly suspicion rewired my brain, how easily trust turned into pattern recognition. 3 days later, I asked her to sit down with me at the kitchen table. My voice sounded steady, which surprised me. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I asked. She froze, just for a second, but it was enough. Then her shoulders dropped, like she'd been waiting for permission to stop holding something up. "Yes," she said quietly. She didn't deny it. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it made everything worse. She told me his name was Evan, that they'd met through work, that it started as emotional support and got complicated. She cried at the right moments, apologized in complete sentences, explained things in a way that sounded practiced but sincere enough to believe. "I felt lonely," she said. "I didn't know how to talk to you about it." I asked her why she hadn't just left me. She looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "Because I still love you." That sentence landed harder than the messages. Love and betrayal occupying the same space. Guilt tangled with hope. I wanted to believe her, not because it felt right, but because believing her would make this survivable. We talked for hours, counseling, boundaries, transparency. She promised it was over, promised she'd cut contact, promised she'd do whatever it took to rebuild trust. I agreed to try. On the surface, the story was complete. Infidelity, confession, remorse, a plan forward. But that night, lying beside her in the dark, I felt something I couldn't name, Not anger, not grief, unease, because even as she slept, one thought kept circling my mind, heavy and persistent. If this was really the whole truth, why did it feel like she'd already rehearsed it? After we agreed to work on things, I expected discomfort. Awkward silences, tension thick enough to trip over. Maybe anger surfacing in unpredictable ways. Every article I read said that once infidelity comes into the open, nothing feels normal for a long time. Instead, normal came back too fast. Marissa didn't become warmer. She became deliberate. She asked about my day, but the questions sounded practiced, like lines she'd rehearsed on the drive home. She suggested counseling and booked the first session herself. She showed up early, took notes, said the right things at the right moments. From the outside, it looked like accountability. From the inside, it felt staged. The first thing that bothered me was her phone. After her confession, I expected openness, a shared passcode, a visible effort to prove there were no more secrets. Instead, 2 days later, she changed the lock entirely. When I asked about it, she didn't get defensive. That would have been easier to understand. She stayed calm. "I need some boundaries while we heal," she said. "The therapist said rebuilding trust doesn't mean zero privacy." She was right, technically. I nodded, feeling unreasonable for even asking. Still, the unease grew. The notifications came next, not messages, alerts, banking apps, document uploads, emails that flashed for half a second before disappearing. Each time she had an explanation ready. Work reimbursements, client paperwork, just spam. The explanations changed. The confidence didn't. Counseling continued. We talked about communication styles, unmet needs, emotional distance. The therapist focused on repair, which made sense given what we thought we were fixing. Marissa cried at the right moments, apologized again, promised again, but she never seemed afraid of losing me. That realization hit one night while I was lying awake beside her, listening to her breathe. If I were the one who'd cheated, I would have been watching for signs, waiting for anger, bracing for the moment my partner decided they were done. Marissa wasn't bracing for anything. She moved through our days with a quiet confidence that didn't match her supposed guilt, like someone who already knew how this story ended. The next thing that didn't fit was the mail. We'd always opened it together, sorting through bills and ads while dinner cooked. Somewhere along the line, Marissa started getting to it first. I noticed because there were days when nothing showed up, even when I knew we were expecting things. When I asked, she said she'd already handled it, that she didn't want me stressed. One afternoon, I came home early and heard the shredder running in the office. Marissa jumped when she saw me, hands still on the machine. "Old stuff," she said quickly. "Just clearing clutter." I didn't argue, but that night, after she fell asleep, I checked the trash. The shredded paper was too fine to read, but there was too much of it. More than junk mail, more than expired statements. That was the first night I broke my own rules. I didn't go through her phone. I didn't open her email. I went to our shared laptop, the one we'd both used for years, the one that still remembered passwords and synced files automatically. I told myself I was just checking for peace of mind. What I found didn't give me that. Buried inside generic folders were documents I didn't recognize. Spreadsheets, scanned forms, PDFs with names that meant nothing to me at first, until I saw mine. At first I assumed it was normal, joint finances, shared accounts, that kind of thing. But the deeper I looked, the tighter my chest felt. Loan amounts I didn't recognize. Business names I'd never heard of. Dates that overlapped perfectly with the months she'd been busy with work. And signatures that looked like mine. I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. That stress was distorting my memory, that I must have signed things without realizing it. But one thought kept returning, heavier each time. Cheating is chaotic. What I was looking at wasn't. I copied the files onto a flash drive and put everything back exactly the way I'd found it. When Marissa kissed me goodbye the next morning, I smiled back, but something inside me had shifted. If I was going to understand what was happening, I couldn't confront her yet. I needed to know what story she thought I was living in, and I needed to find out what the affair was actually meant to distract me from. Once I saw the documents, I couldn't unsee them. They sat in my mind like an open tab I couldn't close, running quietly in the background no matter what else I tried to focus on. Every conversation with Marissa, every casual smile, every apology suddenly felt layered, like there was a second meaning underneath the one she wanted me to hear. I didn't panic. That surprised me. Instead, a strange calm settled in. Whatever this was, reacting emotionally would only make it worse. If she'd gone to this much effort already, then confrontation would give her time to adjust, to move things I couldn't see yet. So I played my role. I went to counseling. I talked about forgiveness and rebuilding trust. I nodded at the right moments. I let Marissa believe I was still exactly where she thought I was, hurt, confused, but committed. At night, when she slept, I worked. The files I'd copied didn't explain themselves. They were fragments, pieces of something larger that only made sense when viewed together. I started making lists, business names, account numbers, dates, anything that repeated. One name came up more than the rest, a consulting firm I'd never heard of. It sounded intentionally vague, the kind of name designed to disappear into paperwork. When I searched for it online, I found a minimal website and a registration address tied to a shared office space downtown. That alone didn't prove anything. What bothered me was how little else existed. No employees listed, no public clients, no history. Just enough of a footprint to look legitimate if someone glanced at it once, and just vague enough to avoid attention. I kept digging. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. The documents weren't random. They followed a timeline that lined up perfectly with subtle changes I'd noticed but dismissed. Slight increases in credit balances, lines of credit I assumed were pre-approved offers, statements I didn't remember opening. My name appeared as a co-signer on documents I didn't remember signing. My digital signature showed up on forms I was certain I'd never seen. At first, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. That maybe I'd authorized something without fully understanding it. That maybe this was all part of some tax or financial strategy Marissa had handled on our behalf. Then I opened one file that shattered that illusion completely, a liability agreement. My name wasn't just on it. It was central. If the venture failed, the responsibility fell on me. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't discomfort anymore. It wasn't suspicion. It was fear. I still didn't confront Marissa. Instead, I did something that felt surreal even as I was doing it. I contacted the consulting firm. I didn't use my real name. I didn't use my real email. I framed myself as a potential client, someone curious about asset protection and financial restructuring. They responded quickly. The man who called introduced himself as Evan, the same name from the messages. Hearing it out loud made my stomach tighten, but I kept my voice steady. I asked questions, let him talk. He sounded confident, casual, like this was routine. He spoke about shielding assets, about transferring liabilities, about preparing for life transitions. Divorce, he meant. He never said the word, but it hovered over everything he described. I asked how spouses usually reacted when they found out. There was a pause, just long enough to notice. That depends, he said finally, on how cooperative they are. That was the moment the last piece slid into place. Evan wasn't a mistake. He wasn't a moment of weakness or emotional escape. He was infrastructure. The affair made sense now. Not as recklessness, but as design. It was dramatic enough to explain secrecy, distance, and emotional withdrawal without inviting deeper scrutiny. Cheating would keep me focused on pain instead of paperwork. That night, Marissa told me counseling was helping, that she felt hopeful again, that she was glad I'd given us a chance. I looked at her and realized something that made my chest tighten. She wasn't afraid of losing me. She was afraid of me noticing. And if I confronted her now, before I understood the full scope of what she'd done, I'd lose whatever advantage I still had. So I stayed quiet. I documented everything. Emails, screenshots, timelines. I spoke to a lawyer anonymously, laying things out as hypotheticals. His answer confirmed what I already suspected. If I did nothing, this could ruin me. The affair wasn't the center of the story. It was camouflage. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that Marissa hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She'd been positioning me as the fall guy. Up until then, I was still holding on to a softer version of the story. Yes, Marissa had cheated. Yes, she'd lied. But some part of me wanted to believe things had simply spiraled, that she'd crossed emotional lines and then panicked, scrambling to protect herself when the risk of losing me became real. That belief didn't disappear all at once. It eroded. The more I reviewed the documents, the more I noticed something unsettling. Nothing conflicted. Every file fit neatly into place. Dates lined up, names repeated, decisions flowed logically from one to the next. This wasn't damage control, it was planning. I kept coming back to Evan. The way he spoke, the confidence, the language he used. Not emotional, not defensive, strategic, precise, like someone used to explaining outcomes, not mistakes. So instead of confronting Marissa, I leaned further into the role I was already playing. I contacted Evan again. This time, I didn't ask emotional questions, I asked practical ones. What happens when spouses start noticing discrepancies? How often do plans like this get disrupted? What usually causes things to go wrong? He didn't hesitate. He talked about narrative control. He explained that when people believe they've uncovered the truth, especially an emotional truth, they stop digging. That betrayal, particularly cheating, creates enough chaos to satisfy curiosity. Pain replaces analysis. Anger replaces logic. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Once someone thinks they know why they're hurting, he said, they rarely ask what else is happening. That was it. The shape of everything snapped into focus. The affair wasn't sloppy, it wasn't reckless. It wasn't even particularly well hidden. The messages weren't encrypted. The contact name was plausible. The emotional tone was intense but contained. It was discoverable. Marissa hadn't tried to hide the affair forever. She'd tried to hide it just long enough for it to do its job. Cheating explained the distance, the secrecy, the late nights. It gave me a place to put my anger, somewhere loud and emotional, while the real work happened quietly in the background. Forgiveness wasn't a risk to her plan, it was a requirement. That's when I stopped pretending with Evan. I told him who I really was. There was a pause, not of fear, not of guilt, but of irritation, like a conversation that had gone off script. He didn't deny anything. He didn't apologize. He said calmly, "Marissa believed this would be easier for you." Easier. That word landed harder than any confession could have. The cheating hadn't been a mistake. It had been a tool. That night, I watched Marissa closely for the first time without emotion blurring my vision. She talked about counseling like it was a box she'd checked. She talked about rebuilding trust like she already knew the ending. At one point, she looked at me and said, "I know I hurt you, but I'd never do anything to ruin your life." I realized how carefully she'd chosen her words. She never said she hadn't. She said she wouldn't. And by then, the damage was already in motion. That was the moment I stopped seeing myself as a husband trying to heal a broken marriage. I wasn't inside a relationship crisis. I was inside a constructed distraction. The affair wasn't the betrayal. It was the cover story. And once I understood that, I knew one thing for certain. If I reacted emotionally now, I'd lose everything. So I stayed calm. And I started planning my exit from a story she thought she controlled. Once I accepted that the affair had been deliberate, everything slowed down in a way that felt unreal. I expected panic, sleepless nights, some kind of emotional collapse. Instead, my days began to feel distant, like I was standing just outside my own life watching it continue without me. I needed to know how bad the damage already was. So I started with the one thing I couldn't afford to guess about: my name. Late one night, sitting alone in the dark with my laptop balanced on my knees, I ran a full credit report. I remember telling myself this was just a precaution, that I was overreacting, that stress had a way of exaggerating things. It was worse than I imagined. Accounts I didn't recognize, inquiries I hadn't authorized. Lines of credit opened and nearly maxed within months. Everything technically legal, everything technically mine. Seeing it laid out like that made my stomach drop. This wasn't theoretical anymore. I printed everything, highlighted dates, cross-referenced them with the documents I'd copied earlier. The overlap was exact. While I'd been focused on repairing our marriage, Marissa had been hollowing out my financial identity piece by piece. The affair hadn't slowed her down. It had bought her time. I confronted her carefully, not with accusations, those would only trigger rehearsed defenses, but with curiosity. I asked about one specific charge, framing it like something I'd just noticed. She didn't hesitate. She explained it away using language I recognized now, consultant phrasing, risk management terms, words designed to reassure without actually answering. She was good at this. Too good. That's when it hit me how long she'd been preparing. How many times she'd practiced these explanations. The affair hadn't just distracted me, it had trained her to lie calmly to my face. The cost wasn't just financial. It started showing up everywhere. I stopped sleeping properly. I ate without tasting food. At work, I stared at screens without processing what was on them. Friends noticed something was wrong, but I didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. How do you tell someone your wife didn't just cheat on you? She used you. I met with a lawyer in person this time, not hypothetically, not anonymously. I brought everything, documents, timelines, messages. He listened without interrupting. When he finally spoke, he didn't soften it. "If this escalates," he said, "you're exposed." Exposed was a polite way of saying ruined. Some of the damage could be contained. Some of it couldn't. A lot depended on Marissa, on how cooperative she chose to be, and whether she decided to move faster once she sensed resistance. That was the real danger. As long as we were married, she had access. Time. Plausible deniability. If she suspected I was preparing to leave or protect myself, she could accelerate everything before I was ready. And she might. I started living like every day was borrowed. I checked balances obsessively, flinched when my phone buzzed, rehearsed conversations in my head trying to predict which version of the truth she'd use next. Meanwhile, Marissa seemed lighter, relieved. She talked about the future again, about trips we might take, about how counseling had helped her realign her priorities. She acted like the hardest part was behind us. That's when I understood something that chilled me. She thought she'd won. The affair had done exactly what it was meant to do. I'd forgiven her. I'd stopped asking emotional questions, and as far as she knew, I was still blind to the real game unfolding underneath. The cost wasn't just what she'd taken already. It was what she could still take if I moved too soon. And somewhere in the middle of that fear, another realization settled in. Quiet, steady, unavoidable. If I wanted to survive this, I couldn't just react. I had to move with intent. Because the moment she realized I saw past the cover story, the clock would start ticking for real. The answer didn't come from Marissa. By then, I understood something important about her. Honesty only appeared when it was useful. If I wanted the truth, the kind that didn't serve her, I needed someone who had known her before she learned how to perform remorse. That person was her sister, Alina. Alina and I had always gotten along, not close, but comfortable. The kind of relationship built on holidays, polite conversations, and the shared assumption that we were both adults who meant well. She was sharper than Marissa, less interested in appearances, less patient with excuses. I reached out under the pretense of concern. I told her things had been hard between Marissa and me. That counseling was bringing up old issues, that I wanted to understand her better. There was a long pause after I said that. "I was wondering how long it would take," Alina said. That sentence hit harder than any accusation. We met for coffee a few days later. Alina didn't waste time with small talk. She watched me carefully, like someone deciding whether the truth would help or harm more. "She didn't marry you because things fell apart later," Alina said finally. "She married you because you were safe." The word landed heavier than it should have. Safe. "She needed stability," Alina continued. "Someone predictable, someone who trusted systems, paperwork, routines. You weren't reckless, you weren't suspicious. You believed that if something mattered, she'd tell you." I felt something tighten in my chest, but I stayed quiet. "She knew you'd never micromanage finances," Alina said. "She knew you'd believe her when she said she had things handled, and she knew you'd feel guilty questioning her because that's who you are." I asked her if Marissa had ever loved me. Alina didn't answer right away. "I think she cared about you," she said carefully. "But love, the way you mean it, I don't think that was ever the point." That was the moment the last illusion cracked. The affair hadn't been the beginning of the betrayal. The financial manipulation hadn't been either. The beginning was the marriage itself. I wasn't a partner who'd been wronged. I was a foundation she'd built on, a structure she'd relied on until it no longer suited her plans. Suddenly, everything made sense. Her calm during the confession, her confidence in counseling, her certainty that I would stay. She hadn't gambled on love. She'd bet on my character. And for a long time, she'd been right. When I got home that evening, Marissa asked how my day had been. I looked at her and realized I was finally seeing her clearly. Not as a villain, not as a monster, but as someone who'd made a series of calculated choices and committed to them. I told her I needed some space. She watched me closely, searching my face for information, for reassurance, for limits. For the first time, something flickered behind her calm expression. Uncertainty. She asked if I was thinking about leaving. I said I was thinking about the truth. That night, I slept in the guest room. Not because I was angry, but because I was done pretending. I had the documents, I had the timelines, I had confirmation of intent. All that was left was deciding how to step out of a story that had been written for me long before I ever knew I was part of it. The next move wouldn't be emotional. It would be final. I didn't leave the next morning. That surprises people when I tell them this part. They expect a dramatic exit, bags packed, a confrontation that finally burns everything down. But drama would have served her. Emotion always had. Instead, I stayed long enough to protect myself. Over the next few weeks, I moved quietly. I separated accounts where I legally could, froze my credit, documented everything, followed my lawyer's instructions down to the letter. Every step felt surreal, like dismantling a life I was still living inside of. At home, Marissa stayed polite, curious but careful. She knew something had shifted. She just didn't know how far. Counseling stopped. I told her I needed time to think without an audience. She agreed too easily. Another detail I noticed too late. She didn't fight for the marriage. She assessed it. When I finally told her I was filing for divorce, she didn't cry. She asked logistical questions. What hurt wasn't that she didn't beg me to stay. It was that she'd clearly prepared for this outcome long before I ever had. The paperwork moved quickly. Her lawyer responded faster than mine expected. The divorce took 2 years. 2 years of untangling contracts I'd never agreed to, of proving intent, of watching savings disappear into legal fees and settlements. I lost money. I lost time. I lost friends who didn't know what to believe because the truth sounded too calculated to be real. But I didn't lose my name. That mattered more than I understood at the time. Evan's firm eventually collapsed under investigation. Not because of me alone, but because I wasn't the only one. That realization came quietly, without satisfaction. I hadn't been special, just suitable. Marissa moved on quickly. New city, new job, new version of the story. I don't know who she's telling it to now or what role she's casting herself in this time. I don't follow her anymore. People still ask me about the cheating, if that was the hardest part, if it broke me. I tell them the truth. Cheating hurts. It humiliates you. It makes you question your worth. But cheating is emotional damage. What she did was structural. She didn't just betray my trust. She tried to rewrite my future without my consent. She assumed I'd stay focused on heartbreak while she walked away clean. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how close she came to succeeding. And then I think about the version of myself who believed the affair was the worst thing I'd discover. I was wrong. But I was also lucky, because I saw the cover story for what it was, just in time to step out from under it. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's simple. When someone shows you a betrayal that feels almost too obvious,